Okay, guys. Going a little more informal today. We're on chapter 2 of how the Irish saved civilization. No, that cough was not the coronavirus craziness. It's allergies acting up. I'm pretty certain. So again, how the Irish saved civilization. Chapter 2, what was lost? The complexities of the classical tradition. And again, these reviews are not to take the place of your own reading of the text. They're more kind of just to help, sort of a guide, as you're thinking about how you're going to address whatever specific issue you're talking about in your paper. All right, so page 35. Um, Third line, first paragraph. A world in chaos is not a world in which books are copied and libraries maintained. So, with the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe is in chaos. The barbarians, quote unquote, i.e., the desperate minorities on the outskirts that are trying to get into Rome, where there's all this wealth and warmth and food, and it's a warmer climate than where a lot of these tribes are coming from, right? It's just better all around. And so they come in, and the whole place is in chaos because these people are interested in the bare necessities of life, to quote the Jungle Book, right? And so they're not interested in books. Most of them are illiterate. They're not interested in books. They're not interested in maintaining libraries. And so all of this stuff gets trashed. Moving down on that page, last line of the second paragraph, the Vandals were not the only Vandals. So, the Vandals being one of the Germanic tribes that's coming in, they're not the only ones vandalizing everything, even though we get the term vandalizing from their name, from, the idea that they came in with the rest of the quote unquote barbarians and, trashed the Roman Empire, when in fact they just were not interested in art and books at the time. They were interested in survival and food and warmth. And so they naturally trashed some stuff. It's like, well, I can't read this book. Why don't I use it for firewood, right? But the Vandals were not the only Vandals. He talks in this second paragraph about how there were a lot of Roman citizens at the time who were taking advantage of the desperation and the chaos around them to get ahead as well as they could. They were taking building blocks from these destroyed buildings and carting them out to the countryside and building themselves little mini mansions from the ruins of public buildings and stuff. Last paragraph on page 35, there were bands of highway robbers running around, increasingly composed of the ruined and the dispossessed, those who had lost everything as a result of the social changes. Page 36. The countryside, once the very image of Roman peace. So it used to be all peace and, the the Pax Romana, Paxromana, which means the peace of Rome, the world peace that was created by Caesar Augustus and the Roman Empire, which, it wasn't world peace for everybody, but it was a lot more peaceful than now. Now you've got chaos. Illegal brotherhoods of extortionists formed basically what was the mafia, the beginning of the mafia. A lot of the middle class had been accustomed to sending their children to be nursed by shepherds in pure mountain air. Began to find it impossible to retrieve those children. So middle class people had, were like, this city environment is so bad. I'm going to send my kids off to the countryside for a price to be taking care of shepherds and people in the countryside. But now suddenly they can't get their kids back because out in the countryside, they're like, wait a second, you're not on top anymore. You're not the upper crust anymore. You need to pay a ransom if you want your kid back. So the term shepherd kind of becomes synonymous with kidnapper in that culture. Page 37, looking at that second paragraph, you have the wholesale enslavement of free men and women. Estate agents for the great landlords often acting as redeemers of Roman citizens seized in barbarian raids. The object was usually not the freedom of the Roman prisoner, but his fresh enslavement as a serf on the landlord's estate. It's kind of like after the Civil War, when black people who had been freed were rounded up by their former slave owners and employed on their plantations. I basically turned into slaves again, and they just pretended that, well, we're just hiring you now that you're free. This is kind of what was going on in the Roman Empire with like Roman citizens after all this happened. Except they weren't formerly slaves. They were citizens that had been living on the Roman land. Page 37, third paragraph. The barbarians, too, were likely to enslave whomever they could lay their hands on. In the slavery business, no tribe was fiercer or more feared than the Irish. So, again, at this time, there were like landlords and barons who owned large pieces of land. And when invasions would happen, they would say, oh, all of you people, all of you Roman citizens, come here to my property and I'll take care of you. But after the Germanic peoples passed on, they wouldn't let them go. They forced them to stay and work their land for them. So it's all this human trafficking, basically by trickery, which is what human trafficking is so many times today, right? They find some way to deceive you, and then you're trapped. And the Irish were particularly feared as a tribe that went around to different areas, attacking, burning, raping, pillaging, and kidnapping people. We'll come back to that. That is very important for this story. We're on page 38. So, bottom paragraph, again, third line, what was lost when the Roman Empire fell? So, what gets lost when the empire collapses? 3 lines from the bottom of page 38. What died when no one any longer had the leisure to pass on the essentials of the classical tradition? When the barbarians burned the libraries and the books turned to dust, when the stones remaining were reassembled into rural outhouses. So when all of this happens, what ultimately, what dies as a result of this? Page 39. After the break there on page 39, end of that first paragraph, it's talking about this guy, Augustine. And he, no, you know what? Ignore that. Well, no, this is pretty interesting, and this might figure into your paper. So on page 39, it talks about this guy named Augustine who went to Carthage, which is a North African city, seeking adventure. He says that first paragraph after the break on 39, as yet I loved no one, yet I loved to love, and out of a deep-seated need I hated myself for not being needy. I pursued whoever, whatever might be lovable, in love with love. So basically, he was chasing girls around, and chasing adventure. Safety I hated, and any course without danger. For within me was a famine. Inside he was starved, emotionally, spiritually starved for something. And so he's going around eating whatever he can, eating, women, eating adventure, metaphorically, right? But through it all, but though it still reads awfully well, the words of Augustine's Confession. So he's talking about this in this book Augustine wrote, Augustine's Confessions. no longer jump with the fresh shock they held when he published his memoir in 401, probably the same year that Patrick was kidnapped. And we'll come back to Patrick's kidnapping by the Irish. Go down later in that paragraph. For Augustine is the first human being to say I and to mean what we mean today. His confessions are therefore the first genuine autobiography in human history. So Augustine is changing history here with this book where he talks about his inner hunger and stuff, and he's desperately trying to fill this emptiness, this famine inside of him. He's writing what you could really say is the first autobiography in history, where somebody says I, and they kind of mean what we think of when we think about writing diaries and journals and our personal reflections. I. You have that with Augustine. He kind of, he's possibly the first person we've got that talks like that. Definitely in the European tradition, he is, so we don't want to conceivably that pops up other places throughout world history. One place that it strikes me that definitely seems to pop up, and he mentions this on page 40, the second paragraph. You have Sappho, who is a famous Greek poet, and then you have King David in the Psalms, Psalm 23, God is my shepherd. And David is very personal. But with Augustine, the Confessions, again, you have an autobiography. And it's like, did we really have that anywhere in world literature before? Not like this. Not this personal. Page 41. Top of first sentence. Then we reach Augustine. So again, Augustine, who tells us everything about himself. Like, most of the people in his day and everybody before him mostly would have been like, this is really shocking and uncomfortable. I'm not sure I want to know this much about you. But it's like today on Facebook, we're like this. We're like Augustine. And conceivably, it started with him, who tells us everything. His jealousies as a kid, his thieving as a boy, his stormy relationship with his overbearing mother, his years of philandering, his mental breakdowns, his love for an unnamed peasant girl whom he finally just kicks out the door. All of this stuff, Today, we're like, yeah, tell the whole world about that. Why not? Facebook. But back then, no. End of the first paragraph on 41. For where could my heart flee from my heart? Where could I escape from myself? So Augustine knows he's a terrible person. And he's got this emptiness inside. And he's like, where can I escape from myself? He reminds me of Kurt Cobain, who once said, Kurt Cobain is famous as saying one time, I hate myself and I want to die. I want to kill myself. And he actually did commit suicide. But this is Augustine, Second paragraph, page 41, a few lines down. Here for the first time is a man consistently observing himself not as man in general, but as singular man, as, an individual, not just part of mankind or humankind. Let's include women, right? Even though at the time that Augustine was writing, it was mankind, right? Funny how things change over time, the terminology that gets used. Page 44, first paragraph, the end of that paragraph. Well, let's go on. It is talking about the differences between Greeks and Romans and how they're kind of like Northerners and Southerners in the U.S. today. First paragraph on page 44, the end of it, it says, the cultural relation of Roman to Greek was in many ways not unlike the cultural relation of Englishmen to Frenchmen, of Americans to Englishmen, of Southerners in the U.S. to Northerners in the U.S. In all three relations, simplicity is the virtue and complexity is the vice on one side, while on the other, subtlety is prized and supposedly rustic straightforwardness can give offense. So in the South, we're like those snooty Northerners. And in the North, people are like, those country bumpkins, You go down, you've got this famous saying about the Greeks by a Roman. I am wary of Greeks, even bearing gifts. So there's this idiom that comes down through culture. Be wary, be careful when Greeks come to you with gifts. And it comes from the most famous work of Roman literature, the Aeneid, in which it's a Roman talking about Greeks, those snooty Greeks, kind of like Southerners might talk about the Northerners, right? Um, all right, bottom of page 44. Okay, let's skip that. You can tell I spent hours prepping for this talk, hours and hours before I sat down and practiced it 5 or 6 times, right? No. Page 46, last paragraph. Homer and Virgil are art. Homer is the greatest Greek poet, Virgil is the greatest Roman poet. And each was to his age and place what good movies are to ours. Never a chore, always refreshing, occasionally ennobling. So think of guys like Augustine, too. I mean, these were not boring old guys in their time that you're like, yeah, this isn't new to me. They were new, they were fresh. Nobody had ever heard of talking about, throwing your personal relationships out there for everybody to read about, right? And your personal issues, like we do today all the time. Page 46, last paragraph, the middle. If the Aeneid is language as metaphor, okay, let's skip over that. We're just going to pass over some things here. Stick with me. Don't leave. Don't run away. Okay, so bottom of 55 is talking about Augustine and Greek philosophy. It says, Augustine's spirit resonates with the plangent chords of Plato, the restless, exiled soul looking everywhere for its true home, feasting on sewage while dimly remembering the nectar and ambrosia of high heaven. Plato is right, and his are the most profound descriptions in all the ancient world, the miraculous golden flashes of yearning embedded in the dross of reality, the out-of-jointness of the universe. Who else, Augustine asks himself, even tells of these things? And then the answer comes to him, Saul of Tarsus, the wiry, bald-headed Jew's awkward, important letters signed Paul, the Christians have been using as scripture. For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary the one to the other, so that you cannot do the things that you would. So Augustine is in a world that's in upheaval, right? Everything is being turned over. He's had to leave mainland Europe and flee to Africa, in this sense, to get away from all the chaos. And he's just, the world is so chaotic, and he's like, there's got to be more. C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian philosopher, compared it to a little kid who who maybe lives in the big city in a dirty apartment complex, and his favorite thing to do is to like play with mud in the alley, play in the alley with mud and try and make little castles and stuff with the mud. Well, let's say one day someone comes and offers to take his family on a trip to the beach. And he's like, I don't want to go to the beach. I want to play with my mud and my dirty water in the alley because I'm having fun. And Augustine is like, there has to be something more than the mud and the dirty water in the alley. But what is it? What's the bigger picture? And he's looking for something to give meaning and purpose, to just all the shit hitting the fan around him, right? And what does he discover? He discovers, well, first he discovers Plato, who's arguing that there's something more, that this life is not all the meaning and reality that we have. And then from Plato, he gets led to the Apostle Paul, who is, wrote like a third of the Bible, of the New Testament in the Bible. And Paul was very influenced in the way he put his ideas together. He was very influenced by Plato in just the way he organized his material. And so Augustine finds Christianity and he's like, this is what I need. This is what I need to give me a higher purpose, a higher meaning than chasing girls and drinking myself under the table and freaking out about the chaos around me in society and making mud pies in the ghetto with dirty water. This is the beach and the ocean and the sun. Bottom of 56, the end of that middle paragraph. In other words, if we mud spattered human beings are ever to reach truth, we can do it only because God, a force greater than ourselves, than our war torn selves, has called us. He reaches down, calls us, brings us. We'll never make it on our own steam. And again, I'm not preaching here or anything, and really Thomas Cahill is not preaching here. He's more describing what was going on with Augustine, and there's a point to all this. There's a point socially, historically to all this. So don't think he's trying to evangelize you here or convert you or something. That's just not the point of this. But he's talking about what happened, with Augustine, because of where this is going to go historically. Okay. So Augustine is just transformed by this, finding something higher, realizing that there can actually be order to the universe, even though there's chaos where he is. There's chaos inside of him, there's chaos around him, but it doesn't have to be that way. Spiritually, emotionally, mentally, he can have peace in the realization of something higher, something greater. The beach and the ocean and the sun, so to speak. Okay, page 38. I'm doing time-wise. Okay, page 38. After the break there, the first big paragraph. So again, what would have been lost, this paragraph? We have been using Augustine as a lens for viewing the classical world. So it's kind of using Augustine to see where Christianity was and stuff at the time that all this is going down, at the time that the crap's hitting the fan. So this is kind of like where Christianity was, which, where the Roman world was at this time as the Roman Empire is collapsing, really, So socially things were awful, but then you have some people like Augustine who are just beginning to wake up, to find something higher, something better. In the middle of all of it, and this is important. Again, historically, socially, we'll come back to it. But page 38, we've been using Augustine as a lens for viewing the classical world. What is about to be lost in the century of the barbarian invasions is literature. What's going to be lost? Literature. The content of classical civilization. If the destruction had been complete, had every library been disassembled and every book burned, we might have lost Homer and Virgil, the two greatest Roman and Greek poets, writers, and all of classical poetry, Herodotus and Tacitus, and all of classical history, specifically Roman, Greek, Jewish, Demosthenes and Cicero, and all of classical oratory, speech, Plato and Aristotle, and all of Greek philosophy, and Plotinus and Porphyry, and all. Okay, we would have lost the taste and smell of a whole civilization. So are we talking all of civilization? No, because you still got Indian civilization, you've got Middle Eastern civilization, these things. And so Cahill, I think he's careful here. He doesn't say we would have lost the taste and smell of all of civilization, because it's absurd. We would have lost the taste and smell of a whole civilization, i.e. Roman, Greek, possibly much of Hebrew, Christians, culture and civilization. We're not talking the whole world here, obviously. That, you know, it would be pretty narrow to say that, pretty narrow-minded to argue that, which it's not what Cahill's arguing. 12 centuries of lyric beauty, aching tragedy, intellectual inquiry, scholarship, sophistry, and love of wisdom would all have gone down the drain of history. All but a few lines of Sappho and much of the work of the Greek tragedians did go down the drain. So a lot of stuff did go down the drain. It totally disappeared. We very nearly lost the whole of Latin literature. We almost lost all of Latin literature, which is like, yeah, Roman literature. It's what the most used translation of the Bible was written in, translated into. Top of 59. The struggle for existence and the struggle with fear now gain the ascendancy once more. What remains of classical civilization will be henceforth found not in life, but between the covers of books. So now it's all about the struggle just to survive and the struggle not to give in to fear as everything's crashed down. And the people who are coming in, you know, the people who were there to begin with are terrified, running for their lives. The people who are coming in, all they care about is existence. What is really lost when a civilization wearies and grows small is confidence. A confidence built on the order and balance that leisure makes possible. So he says, so Cahill is like, what really gets lost when a civilization gets tired, when it starts falling instead of rising? People are not confident anymore. You know, we have no confidence in the government. You know, you're not confident in your government. You're not confident in your economy. You're not confident in each other. I was talking to a friend last year, and he said that after 9/11, you know, we were talking about how did America change after 9/11? And my friend's response when I asked him was, he said, well, that's simple. We don't trust each other anymore. You know, we don't leave our doors unlocked as much as we used to. So my friend's response to how has America changed since 9/11? He said, we don't trust each other anymore. You know, we don't have confidence in each other, in our society, in our government. Not that everybody trusted each other and had confidence before 9/11, but it's more so now. Yeah, and so when you have confidence, then you relax and you take time to sit around and talk about ideas and write great literature and great music and stuff, and create great art. When you're confident, you know, when you feel like we're going somewhere, we're accomplishing something, we're doing something great. But when a society is collapsing, you lose your confidence. And with that, you lose, you know, whatever stirs you up to greatness in your society, right? Okay, page 60. The first full paragraph. Okay, ignore that. Page 60, the last big paragraph there. But this picture alone would be misleading. Just as we found earlier that the ancients had far greater respect than we for practical public discourse, so they also had far greater fear of chaos. He's saying page 61, people forgot many things, how to read, how to think, how to build magnificently, but they remembered and they mourned the lost peace. So they forgot a lot of stuff, but the thing they were saddest about and depressed most about was that peace was gone. Call them the people of the Dark Ages, if you will, but do not underestimate the desire of these early medieval men and women for the rule of law. There was, moreover, one office that survived intact from the classical to the medieval culture, the office of Catholic bishop. So he's saying sometimes we look down on the Middle Ages because we're like, they were just under the thumb of the Catholic Church. Everybody was just being ruled. But he said, you know, when we talk like that, we don't understand that the medieval ages was came after this chaos. And so to people, what was important to them was not independence, doing your own thing, everybody, having their own church, whatever. It was order. It was government. It was a sense of being able to depend on something. And they didn't want to go back to chaos. And so kind of when we call that the Dark Ages and look down on the time when like the Catholic Church was kind of organizing and running stuff, and um, it's kind of like we don't really understand where they'd come from. They'd come out of this crazy chaos that almost that destroyed everything around them, right? And they wanted order. They wanted the comfort of somebody being in charge, and somebody with authority and power. All right. 61. In late antiquity, as municipal and provincial governments disintegrated, okay, we're kind of going to skip on through some of that. It's basically just talking about what we were just talking about. But imagine if, in our country, heaven forbid, with the coronavirus and stuff, imagine if everybody just went nuts and we collapsed. You had people out burning stuff and destroying. After that, will we all be about, let's all do our own thing and express ourselves individually, right? And run out and stick our noses up at the police and stuff? No, we would want order. We would be like, we don't want chaos again, So it's understanding the perspectives of different cultures. Hopefully it doesn't come to all that I was just talking about. Page 62. The first full paragraph. By the end of Augustine's life, such consultation was becoming the exception. So it's talking about how the Roman Catholic bishops were like leaders in their communities. The church leaders were leaders, and people came to them because they were the educated ones, the only ones who still knew how to read and stuff, and asked them for stuff. And at first, they were very humble and just wanted to serve and help their people. But then they became very proud, and they thought, maybe I am special because I can read and nobody else can. And so more and more, even though, it starts out as a good thing, they're just trying to help their people. And of course, they're kind of in positions of authority because they know more, they've read more, But it kind of turns into a thing where suddenly, according to Cahill and his take on history, that these Catholic bishops and leaders start grasping at more and more power, and start electing each other instead of the people electing their religious leaders. The leaders start electing the leaders. That's page 62, second and third paragraphs there. Page 61, the middle paragraph there. If the ancient Eastern or Greek church has many fathers, theologians, who the ancient Western or Latin church has only one we're speaking of, Augustine. We're back to Augustine, who was a really deep thinker. Out of his interior dialogues with Plato and Paul, he formulated the doctrine of original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve, passed from generation to generation, of fleshly act of generativity. As in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Augustine interprets these words of Paul as describing the necessary solidarity of the human race, both in falling hopelessly into sin and rising by grace to redemption. He formulates the doctrine of grace, the gift of God, freely given to men who cannot merit. He even formulates an explanation of the Trinity. God is one, as in the Old Testament. And that the Trinity loves each other. So God is just not this one lonely dude. He's actually three parts, and they have a friendship. They have a relationship with each other. And so these ideas, original sin, grace, you're saved by grace, the Trinity. Augustine, it's in there, it's in the Bible, but Augustine's the one who takes these ideas and expresses them the way that like Christians understand them today. So he's Christianity's deep thinker at this time period. Not that all that stuff isn't in the Bible, but he like puts it together in a way that people can say, oh yes, that's that's the idea. Page 64, Middle paragraph, Augustine's enemies are many. He crosses swords with this fat monk who just believes be all you can be. And Augustine's like, well, how's that working for you? Augustine's like, I tried to be all I can be. I found out that people are flawed. We're not perfect. We can't just pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We need someone, and Augustine's argument is we need God, because we're not perfect. We'd like to be better people, but we can't just make ourselves into the perfect image. We need help. So Augustine's arguing his views with different people with other like Catholic bishops and stuff. Of course, top of page 65, Augustine also goes off the rails a bit, as Thomas Cahill puts it. As Augustine grows older, he gets angrier, more frustrated with some people who don't agree with him on stuff, other Catholic bishops and stuff. And Augustine arguably formulates the idea that eventually creates things like the Spanish Inquisition, which is when, the Catholic Church in Spain actually tortured and murdered people for like wrong beliefs, for not having beliefs that agreed with the church, which is awful. And so Augustine, being a human being, not being God, he's going off the rails some near the end of his life. And he didn't come out and say we need the Inquisition, but some of his ideas very clearly, Thomas Cahill argues, led to things like the Spanish Inquisition. So humanity is very flawed. We never find the perfect median and just sit there. We always go way over this way. And then we're like, oh, dude, we're too far over this way. So what do? Do we come back to the middle? No, we go over this way. It's just human nature. Whether you're talking about, human rights or religion or politics or whatever, I think, if you were going to argue that human nature is flawed, that we are innately flawed and sinful, if you were going to argue that, one of the clearest evidences of it might be that we never come to the middle and say, here we are, let's go. We're always over here or over here. We never correct to the middle. We always correct to, something equally awful. All right, little diatribe there, a little lecture. Of course, this whole thing is a lecture. Page 65, second paragraph. Augustine, who, as we saw, believed that God had predestined each of us from all eternity, therefore nice it. Okay, skipping that. That's more on what we were just talking about with Augustine going off the deep end near the end of his life. There's this funny little thing on page 65 where Augustine is talking about how sex is evil, which is not, for people who think that's not a Christian belief, but there have been certain people that have let their minds go that way. And Augustine is like, sex is evil, if we didn't have, I don't know. And one of the other bishops says, Augustine, I don't agree with you. In fact, I have sex with my wife whenever I want to. And Augustine said, what? I can't believe you're telling me that. He's like, that's so nasty. And it's like, dude, in our culture, we're like, are you kidding me? What are you talking about, right? But it's funny that Augustine has gone around full circle to where, at the beginning of his life with Confessions, he's bringing out all his own trash and nastiness and writing it down, as part of his life story. And now he's like, near the end of his life. And it's funny how, as we get older, most of us become much more conservative. Maybe because we realize it's easier to break things, even our bodies. So we become much more conservative. And Augustine is becoming much more conservative as he grows older. He's like, we can't talk about sex. Whereas in his Confessions, he talks about it all the time. He goes into great detail. So It's a part of human nature. We become more conservative as we grow older because we realize that things are not as permanent. Ourselves, for example. Page 67. Last paragraph. Meanwhile, on an island off the Atlantic coast that had never heard of Augustine or his battles. That was a very long introduction getting to the Irish, which we almost haven't talked about yet. But meanwhile, in Ireland. And that will start us off in our next chapter, our next lecture. Thanks for listening, although you're kind of required to, but hey, as my students. Talk to you later.